2022 be read a second time. So People Before Profit have put forward this bill seeking to have a referendum to seek to insert neutrality into the Irish Constitution. Many people believe that military neutrality, Ireland's neutrality, is protected in the Constitution because there's a long understanding and overwhelming support for the idea that Ireland should be neutral, but in fact it is not. That neutrality is not protected in the Constitution and in our view is seriously under attack at the moment. That successive governments have sought to undermine that neutrality, most egregiously with the decisions of previous governments to allow millions of US troops go through Shannon Airport to prosecute bloody and unjustifiable wars in Afghanistan and then Iraq. Most egregiously, a war based on a pack of lies about weapons of mass destruction that led to the death of 1 million people directly and indirectly and essentially destroyed Iraqi society, damage from which it will probably not recover for decades, if ever. And Ireland facilitated that, even though it's supposed to be a neutral country. We have facilitated the outrageous practice, so-called rendition, better termed kidnapping and torture by the US, where they send Gulf Stream jets around the world, kidnap people they consider to be threats to American security with no trial, no due process, and then take them to black sites around the world and torture them, often in regimes that are despotic, brutal regimes in and of themselves who allow the US to carry on this practice. And then, of course, most recently, the government have sought to exploit the Ukrainian crisis, the terrible crisis in Ukraine, and what is undoubtedly a bloody imperialist and murderous war that has been initiated by Vladimir Putin. But the Irish government and indeed wider European political establishment are seeking to exploit that terrible crisis in order to justify moving towards greater EU militarisation, the establishment of a European army and closer alignment with NATO. Micheál Martin said recently, quote, "Neutrality is a policy issue that can change at any time." Leo Varadkar, "I think we'll need to think about deeper involvement in European defence." Simon Coveney suggested that we needed to spend more resources on defence as well as for cooperation with other EU countries and partnerships with NATO in some areas. That's what you were reported as saying in the United States at a meeting at a meeting you attended in the United States. You can respond during the debate to that suggestion. And of course, you've suggested that we may get involved in this expanded rapid reaction force of 5,000 troops, which is essentially the embryo of a European army. Now, I want to say that Ireland's neutrality and the struggle for an independent Irish Republic are one and the same thing. They always have been, and that to move away from Ireland's neutrality is not just some sort of interesting tactical or strategic choice, it is in fact a betrayal of the essential struggle to establish an independent republic. Going right back to Wolfe Tone, who first advocated both Irish independence and Irish neutrality, and then to James Connolly and those who led people out in 1916, and the entire Irish Revolution. As soon as World War I broke out, James Connolly established the Irish Neutrality League to argue that Ireland should be in no way a participant or supporter of either of the warring sides in the First World War. He wrote at the time something that echoes pretty strongly today, I have to say. He said, "Should the working class of Europe, rather than slaughter each other for the benefit of kings and financiers, proceed to erect barricades all over Europe to break up bridges and to destroy the transport service, that war might be abolished. We should be perfectly justified in following such a glorious example and contributing our aid to the final dethronement of the vulture classes that rule and rob the world. Brilliant, and so correct. They had vulture funds then, robbing the world, just as we have now. And Connolly was clear as soon as that war broke out, when people in Irish politics, in the Home Rule Party, argued that Irish people could, and they did, went out and got slaughtered in that war, Connolly said, no. We oppose both sides in this war, and in fact, it was the outbreak of the First World War, which eventually led to the slaughter of 14 million people, that prompted Connolly to say we had to have a rebellion in Ireland, not just for Irish independence, but to strike a blow against empires and against the slaughter of the First World War. And indeed, the Irish Revolution very significantly accelerated by the conscription crisis of 1918. And indeed, the end of that war, the Irish Revolution, was part of a series of revolutions across Europe, in Russia, in Germany, in France, and so on, against that war. A war that was a slaughter that was ended by the revolt of working people against all the warmongers of Europe. We believe we have to uphold that tradition, which is now under serious threat. Neutrality does not mean indifference. Neutrality means standing against warmongers, standing against empires, standing with the oppressed. If we throw that away, we throw away what is, in fact, the identity of the Irish Republic, the struggle for the Irish Republic, and we would do so at our peril. So we should not do that, and I hope that the House will support our bill.
Deputy Paul Murphy.
Thanks, Lascan Corla. The media reports that the government is opposing this bill on the basis that it's unnecessary. People may ask, what does that mean? Why is it unnecessary? I presume many people will assume that, it's unnecessary because maybe they think that neutrality is already enshrined in the Constitution, which it isn't. Or maybe they think that the government's saying it's unnecessary because, don't worry, there's no threat to neutrality from this government. But the evidence is very clearly to the contrary. I mean, the Taoiseach's own words, the Taoiseach who leads this government, his own words just 2 or 3 weeks ago, very explicitly, neutrality is a policy issue that can change at any time. The refusal, and I'm going to ask again today, but the refusal last week of Paschal Donoghue in Leaders' Questions to even give a commitment to have a referendum before Ireland would sign up for the European Reaction Force, Rapid Reaction Force, which the Minister opposite appears to want to participate in. Exactly, and we've opposed them from years. You've participated in this process of European militarisation. The majority of people in this country defend neutrality. Exactly. So we won't get a referendum. Thank you for the confirmation. Before the government decides to send working class young people from this country abroad to serve in a European military operation. Do we get a commitment from the government to, before they would abandon even the triple lock, which acts as a certain restriction on their ability to again send working class people to fight elsewhere in the world, which is even in the programme for government, but which the Minister opposite has floated the idea of the need to be rid of it. Will we get a referendum before that is ditched? The truth is, the government and their outriders in terms of commentators who are also engaged in a propaganda war against what is left of neutrality, independence from military alliances. The truth is, it's presented as if this is a new thing. This is a necessary, mature response to the horrendous, brutal, criminal invasion by Putin of Ukraine. Whereas the reality is this isn't a new position. It's not a new position from us to say that Ireland should not participate in military alliances, to say and to propose in law that we shouldn't be using Shannon Airport to transport over 2.5 million US troops to the Middle East. But it's also not a new position from the political establishment to try to erode neutrality. Fine Gael, back in 2003, proposed in a policy document to move, quote, beyond neutrality, supporting participation in a common EU defence policy, abandoning the so-called triple lock, and describing the triple lock mechanism then as a political straitjacket. John Bruton at the time said, "You cannot create a political union and then say you're not prepared to defend it. If that is logical, the Taoiseach should now start preparing Irish public opinion for that." Tánaiste de Varadkar has regularly paraphrased this Europe worth defending line. So let's not kid ourselves that this latest push to fully undermine and get rid of this political straitjacket to undermine neutrality is a mere pragmatic response to the war in Ukraine. Instead, it is shock doctrine in action of using a real crisis, a horrendous invasion, horrendous humanitarian catastrophes to try and drive a pre-existing ideological agenda from Fianna Fáil and in particular from Fine Gael. Now it's just reached its most extreme, you feeling confident to almost totally do away with it, raising the idea of joining with NATO. And there is an important point here, which is that NATO is being rebranded as some sort of peace force, as if they were simply the neutral teacher on the playground stopping the bullies. Tell that to the ordinary people of Afghanistan, who had their country invaded and occupied by NATO for years. Who gave NATO or the US the right to consider themselves the world police? The people of Iraq, over 1 million of whom died on the hands of the US invasion, must be left wondering if their suffering at the hands of NATO members has been completely forgotten. When we say neutrality, we don't mean neutral, not being on the side of the oppressed against the oppressor. Everywhere we say we should take the side of the oppressed against the oppressor. But what we mean is, and what's outlined in our bill, is that Ireland should stand up against invasion, war and imperialism. Especially given our own history of colonial oppression, we should be a voice for justice and for the rights of nations to self-determination. And to do that with any credibility, we must not join any of the imperialist clubs. The US-led NATO or the Russia-led CSTO. We propose that people be given a choice. You want to do away with neutrality fully, any semblance left of it, behind the backs of the people. You've cut away at it again and again and again, making a joke of it in terms of the use of Shannon Airport. But we're saying, let's have the debate. Let's have the debate out publicly, allow people to decide, give them a chance to vote to block the government from joining NATO or any other imperialist alliance, as well as blocking participation in a European process of militarisation. I finally make the point to the Green Party, and there's no Green Party TDs here, but Eamon Ryan, Green Party leader, has voted for to enshrine neutrality in the Constitution on 3 previous occasions, 2003, 2016, 2018. It's very clearly in the Green Party manifesto, the question of neutrality. What are they going to do? Are they going to stick to their actual principles, or supposed principles? Are they going to stick to what was decided by their membership in terms of what is in their election manifesto? Are they going to stick to the promises that were made to the electorate? Or will they, like on so many other issues, fold under the pressure of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and fold to the drums of militarisation, the complete abandonment of neutrality? There's lots of quotes I could give from Eamon Ryan, but I don't have time, which would be very appropriate here and which would indicate he should be on this side of the debate rather than backing up the militarisation agenda.
Deputy Breach-Smith.
I guess the first thing to say is that our neutrality is not and should never be confused with the idea of Ireland being indifferent or uninterested in world affairs, or indeed indifferent to the suffering of oppressed peoples globally. A constant snide attack to those of us on the left, on this side of the House, has often been how obsessed we are with far-flung conflicts and the plight of the oppressed people in other parts of the world. We're often criticised and slagged off for that. And that is why we stood with Black Lives Matter, why we protested against Donald Trump, why we marched against the war in Iraq, why we highlighted and opposed the brutal thugs and dictators, wherever they came from, be it Saudi Arabia, China, Burma, Egypt. It's why we marched and defended refugees coming here, why we railed against the treatment of thousands who drowned and are drowning in the Mediterranean or freeze as we speak on the Poland-Belarusian border. I welcome the newfound conscience of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael here in relation to the Ukrainian refugees, but I can't help measure, and we've been trying to do this over the last few weeks, the spectacular hypocrisy involved in the attitude to those from Afghanistan, Yemen or Syria who seem less worthy of human empathy than we are now told is officially sanctioned and being paid for. And that is not to detract at all from the suffering of the Ukrainian people. We are not neutral when it comes to human solidarity and opposing warmongers and dictators of any colour or creed. We are always, as has been said, on the side of the oppressed. And in the words of James Connolly and the generation of socialists and republicans whose struggle gave birth to this state, we serve neither king nor Kaiser. Today, we serve neither Putin nor NATO nor any other imperial bloc. Neutrality is not the absence of feeling of action. It is a defiant pledge of independence from all imperial blocs and military alliances in a world which is increasingly and dangerously dividing into competing blocs and breeding conditions for more and more wars, more deaths and more immense suffering and displacement of millions of people across the globe. Whatever about our concern at the double standards when it comes to the treatment of refugees, it's nothing compared to the revulsion that we feel when we hear commentators and TDs salivating at the thoughts of Ireland growing up and joining NATO or some NATO-aligned military setup. There's a version of mature debate there without showing our willingness to send off. We need a version of mature debate without showing our willingness to send off young men and women to die in foreign fields. But I will say, in fairness to your party minister and others who've been consistent, that you've never hidden your desire to ditch neutrality, and neither have Fianna Fáil when they've inventively ignored the policy of neutrality whenever the opportunity arose. For them, neutrality was more honoured in the breach than the observance. That inventiveness has meant genuflecting to neutrality while also doing whatever it wanted in many cases. The Constitution says, Article 28 of the Constitution says, war shall not be declared and the state shall not participate in any war save with the assent of Dail. Yet despite that, the inventiveness of this establishment's attitude to neutrality has meant the following: acceding to whatever whims the US empire has had. If it wanted to move 3 million troops through Shannon in pursuit of criminal wars, then go ahead. It has meant joining PESCO, meant Ireland joining NATO, the late NATO-led ISAF mission in Afghanistan in 2001. It meant in 2017 Irish troops being deployed on NATO-led missions in Europe. It meant in 1999 Ireland joined NATO's Partnership for Peace. It meant in 2003 Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael voting against a bill to enshrine neutrality into the Constitution. And it meant cooperating in rendition flights, turning a blind eye to the horrors of Western-backed regimes like the Saudis and promising to bump up military expenditure and coordination with the European Union and NATO armaments and hardware. Our traditional policy of neutrality has always been, for Fine Gael and for Fianna Fáil, like a lot of other traditions, it's useful to genuflect to from time to time, but can always be rendered redundant when it's convenient. And we've clearly found now that the horrors of the Russian invasion have given you the right to ditch that genuflecting to neutrality and profess that alliance has to be a full-blown support for NATO or another European Union alliance. The only problem with this, of course, is that you intend to march us to war and future alliances without giving the people of this country a say in that via a referendum. And we want to say here today that that is absolutely imperative, that we have to have a mature debate. You say we have to have a mature debate, so let's have that debate and let's have a referendum. So I appeal, as has been done already by Deputy Murphy, to the Green Party to live by their conscience, by their principles, if they still have them, and to refuse to vote against this bill.
Thank you, and I think a copy of my speech is on the way. If it's not already here, it'll be here very shortly. Count Corliffe, for today's debate, we first need to clarify what we mean when we talk about Ireland's long-standing policy of military neutrality. In practical terms, and as practiced by successive governments for many decades, the policy means that Ireland does not participate in military alliances, nor in common or mutual defence arrangements. As the Taoiseach has said on a number of occasions in recent weeks, military neutrality does not mean we are politically or morally neutral. Neutrality has never stopped us from participating in world events, nor self-evidently from being affected by them. Nor does it mean that we are inactive in situations where we see flagrant breaches of the UN Charter and clear violations of international law, including international humanitarian law. Addressing our Dail in 1963, John F. Kennedy observed that Ireland pursues an independent course in foreign policy, but it is not neutral between liberty and tyranny, and never will be. To quote Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he says, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." And that is the approach we take. For over 60 years, not a day has passed when Ireland's peacekeepers were not on duty in blue helmets somewhere across the world. Our defence forces' record of continuous service is the longest of any UN member state, and with over 500 permanent Defence Force personnel serving as peacekeepers today, our contribution to UN peacekeeping is Europe's highest per capita and 6th highest globally. We've also actively shaped and contributed to the development of the UN's Common Security and Defence Policy, and we are significant contributors to UN-mandated-led crisis management missions around the world. Ireland was amongst the member states that championed the development of a civilian as well as a military crisis management capability by the EU, so that today we have Irish men and women advising on policing and security sector reform, border management, judicial reform, human rights and gender policies, and cybersecurity and hybrid threats in Georgia, in Iraq, in Kosovo, in Ukraine, Somalia, Libya, Niger, and the Central African Republic. Ireland was also to the forefront of designing a new European peace facility, which allows for the strengthening of military and defence capabilities of partners and supports the military aspect of peace support operations, notably those carried out by the African Union and other regional organisations. Ireland ensured that the facility was designed in such a way that countries who did not wish to finance or provide lethal weaponry as part of measures adopted under the peace facility could instead finance non-lethal and protective equipment. We've seen this work in practice in the Ukraine crisis, where Ireland's share of €22 million of the €1 billion support package to the Ukrainian military has gone solely on non-lethal equipment and support. In the view of the government, the bill we are discussing today would serve to seriously undermine our proactive international role. Indeed, the bill would be likely to curtail Ireland's efforts to contribute to international peace and security rather than in any way enhance it. On this basis, the government opposes the bill. Let me outline a number of our key concerns. First, the bill could constrain the executive's ability to exercise its authority in respect of the conduct of internal relations, as already articulated in Article 29 of the Constitution. In particular, the bill, if enacted, could constrain the government's scope to participate in UN peacekeeping missions, particularly missions with a Chapter 7, that is, a peace enforcement mandate. The same would hold true for UN-mandated EU-led or NATO-led peacekeeping or crisis management missions. Currently, the main overseas mission in which Defence Force personnel are deployed are the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, or UNIFIL, as people will know it, with 344 personnel, and the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force, or UNDOF, in Syria with 132 Defence Force personnel. Other missions include the UN-mandated NATO-led International Security Presence KFOR in Kosovo with 13 personnel, and EU-led Operation Althea in Bosnia and Herzegovina with 5 personnel, and the EU-led training mission in Mali with 20 personnel. These missions are undertaken in pursuit of the UN principles of making international peace and security, taking effect collective measures to prevent and remove threats to peace and protect civilians. In apparently seeking to prevent all military action other than defence of our own national territory, this bill would potentially neutralise the ability of Ireland's defence forces to serve overseas. It would remove, or at the very least significantly constrain, a pillar of our engagement in the world which has been characteristic of this state for 75 years. Second, the bill as presented could also potentially go a step further, precluding even the provision of non-lethal equipment and support to regional organisations such as the African Union or to third country partners such as Ukraine, through our participation in the European Peace Facility. It could prevent a current or future Irish government from using the instruments and tools at our disposal, either bilaterally or through the EU, to give practical expression to our foreign policy. To be blunt, it would prevent us putting our money where our mouth is. Third, the bill also purports to provide constitutional guarantees that the state shall not allow its territory to be used by other states to transport war material or personnel to third countries for the purpose of war or other armed conflict. Ceann Comhairle, everyone in this House already knows that foreign state and military aircraft that are permitted to land at Irish airports, including at Shannon, must comply with strict conditions. These include routine stipulations that the aircraft must be unarmed, carry no arms, ammunition or explosives, and must not engage in intelligence gathering, and that the flights in question must not form any part of military exercises or operations. These conditions are applied to all international partners, and they're not specific to individual states, and they'll continue to be applied. Moreover, as deputies will be aware, there are already provisions in the Constitution that underpin Ireland's foreign and security policy framework. In particular, Article 29 establishes the framework within which Ireland conducts its international relations. For example, Article 29(1) reads, "Ireland affirms its devotion to the ideal of peace and friendly cooperation amongst nations founded on international justice and morality." Article 29(2) confirms that Ireland adheres to the principle of the peaceful settlement of international disputes. Article 29(4)(9), which sets out that the state shall not adopt a decision taken by the European Council to establish a common defence pursuant to Article 42 of the Treaty of the European Union, where that common defence would include the state. Indeed, the protocols attaching to the Lisbon Treaty specifically recognise Ireland's policy of military neutrality, stating inter alia, the Lisbon Treaty does not affect or prejudice Ireland's traditional policy of military neutrality. And of course, international deployments of the defence forces, other than for humanitarian purposes, are subject to the triple lock, that is to say, a UN mandate, a government approval, and in the cases of deployments of over 12 personnel, Dail approval as well. Let me finish with a few words about the current international and geopolitical context. We are living in completely unprecedented times. Russia's appalling actions in Ukraine demonstrate an utter disregard for international law, the UN Charter and Europe's collective security architecture, including Russia's own commitments under the OSCE. We need a fresh conversation here in Ireland about our own approach to security and defence, a mature, honest debate about the world that is and Ireland's place in it today. The Taoiseach has already made clear that Ireland's neutrality is fundamentally a policy decision. He has indicated that the issues involved could, at an appropriate time, be discussed through a citizens' assembly or a similar framework. To an extent, part of this conversation has already begun through the work of the Commission on the Defence Forces. And we've already had a long debate on that commission, and I suspect we will have more. It's important that these conversations are allowed to take place in an open and evidence-based way and at an appropriate time. Inserting provisions now into the Constitution on military neutrality without allowing for a serious discussion of the threat environment that Ireland and its EU partners now face and the appropriate response to that threat simply closes off that conversation before it's properly even begun. So, Ceann Comhairle, this is the context in which the government opposes this bill and the constitutional amendments proposed here by the deputies. Thank you.
Deputy McBarrett.
So I would like to begin my contribution with a personal reminiscence. I remember a crowd of kids standing out on the the sidewalk, as we used to say, on the street corner in Columbus, Ohio. I think the year was probably 1970, which would place me at age 6 or age 7. There was a big conversation, and it was all about the so-called crazy kid who lived around the corner. And we were convinced that this teenager was crazy because he had decided to go for a little walk. He decided to go for a little walk right off the roof of his mother's garage, and inevitably he broke his legs. So as far as we were concerned, he was crazy. But of course, he wasn't, because in doing so, he escaped the draft. He avoided Vietnam, he possibly saved his own life, and he probably saved the lives of others. But of course, it was only years later that I realised what was going on here, and that maybe to be crazy in a crazy world makes you one of the sanest of the sane. Now, since then, I have read many history books, and I've studied a few wars as well, including that particular war, in which 58,000 US soldiers died, and in which 3 million Vietnamese people died. And that reading and that study, and maybe even a few childhood experiences such as that, it wasn't the only one, brings me to a point in this Dáil where I approach this discussion as a socialist opponent of imperialist war and militarism, and as a person who casts a very, very sceptical eye on the pronouncements and the propaganda of capitalist spokespersons on these issues. Now, the Irish state has never been a genuinely neutral state. It was neutral in the Second World War, maybe more so than some other wars, but on the side of America and Britain. It was neutral in the Vietnam War, on the side of Uncle Sam, and it was so neutral in the Iraq War that Shannon Airport was given over as a refuelling pit stop for the American war machine. This state came into being on the back of a counter-revolution which overpowered a revolution, which had been driven by the working class and the poor for both national and social liberation. But the revolutionary movement of 1917 to 23 was so powerful that the leaders of the new state felt that they had to tip the hat to its most dearly held sentiments. And clearly a mass movement which had challenged the power of an empire had created a strong anti-imperialist sentiment in the country. So hence, the official policies of the leaders of the new state was neutrality, no overt connections with imperialist power blocs, but unofficially was to give as much political and, where possible, practical support to such blocs. Such has been the hypocrisy of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Irish capitalist class down through the decades. Only now, with the Russian invasion, do they dare to lower the mask and reveal their real ambitions more fully. Now, socialists are not neutral in issues of foreign policy either. The battle between the black South African masses and apartheid capitalism unequivocally on the side of those masses. The struggle between the Iraqi people and the US invaders who were gifted Shannon, sympathies on the side not of some of the factions, but of the Iraqi people themselves. Similarly, in the struggle between the people of Ukraine and Putin's invading army, we stand 100% on the side of the Ukrainian people, support for their right to armed self-defence and resistance, and call for the immediate withdrawal of all Russian troops. As a socialist, I support this bill because it seeks to tie the hands of capitalist governments in this state and to restrict their ability to make military alliances and to restrict their ability to declare war, allowing this only in circumstances where the country has been invaded and only then by way of a decision of Dáil Éireann. I also support it because it asks for ratification of that position by way of referendum. In other words, placing the decision in the hands of the people rather than those who want to strengthen Ireland's military muscle, whether they be in the cabinet or the editorial rooms of the capitalist press. Now, what would a European army look like? What would a rapid reaction force look like? I think you might get a glimpse of this if you look at what is happening today in Africa. A leaked document from the European Union Africa Summit earlier this year stated, and I quote, "The EU wants to scale up its military presence in Africa." The document describes Europe's existing military deployments in Africa as, quote, "stretching from the Sahel to the Gulf of Guinea and from the Horn of Africa to the Mozambique Canal." Echoes of 19th century imperialist talk there. The European Union Observer states that the EU currently has 11 military and naval missions in Africa. Many of these missions are led by France in West Africa, where of course it was formerly the direct colonial power. All of them are serving to prop up pro-EU governments as the EU battles for influence on the continent with the rival imperialisms of China and Russia. The aim of the exercise is not so much to protect democracy. It is to protect sources of cheap minerals and cheap labour. And of course, many of the European capitalist states.
You really insult our own defence forces in their work in Mali with comments like that. You really do. You really do. You're a disgrace. You're a disgrace. You should educate yourself on what we're doing in Mali.
Yeah. Well educated. And in fact,
Is entitled to speak uninterrupted. Please.
We have Defence Force personnel.
The deputy is
lives
entitled.
on the line, and we have to listen to this kind of stuff.
You'll be able to come back. Deputy, please, uninterrupted. Thank you.
who is putting their lives on the line? Of course, many European capitalist states, France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, used to be colonial rulers in Africa and collectively have the blood of millions of people on their hands. That is a historical fact, Minister. Now, the question of peace and stopping war, and today, the key to stopping war and ending the rule of autocrats lies with people power, and more specifically, with workers' power. The Vietnam War I spoke of at the outset was defeated by a pincer movement of the key resistance by the Vietnamese people, but also by the US anti-war movement. The Stalinist dictatorships of Eastern Europe were toppled not by NATO tanks, Minister, but by people power. The beginning of the end of World War I, protests and strikes by Russian workers on the streets, which toppled a Tsar and went on to defeat capitalism, Minister. The key to defeating Putin's war lies with the resistance of the Ukrainian people and the actions of the Russian anti-war movement itself. By the way, the more NATO is involved, the more Putin is strengthened at home, as seen with the comments of Biden in Poland regarding regime change at the weekend. In conclusion, I want to say a word about those who would include yourself, Minister, who want to increase military spending in this country. I want to see more spending on pay and conditions of Defence Force members. Right? We defend the interests of Defence Force members, despite the comments of the Minister earlier on. I want this country to be secure from cyber attacks. I'm aware of a certain hypocrisy here of Fine Gael ministers highlighting the issue of cyber security when you're underfunding of the HSE security systems for years and years and years, left it open not just to attack but being crippled earlier this year. So if there's more money needed to defend the likes of HSE computer systems, no problem. But I am totally opposed to massive increases in spending on arms and the weapons of war. The PESCO target of spending 2% of GDP on military would bring Irish military spending to 3.6 billion. Minister is not supporting that position at this point in time. But do you know what you could do with 3.6 billion euro? Look at the cost of living crisis, the rising price of oil, the rising price of food and fuel. You could give 70% of Irish households a cheque for €1,000 each to offset those fuel and those food price increases. And that's how we will fight this campaign, with class politics, all right? By making the point we need money for our nurses, for our health system, for housing, not to be spending on arms and armaments. And in conclusion, final point, by making the point when you say, Minister, that there's a good chance Ireland will be involved in the Rapid Reaction Force, no chance without major opposition in society, because it's not the sons and daughters of government ministers who will be sent to risk their lives. It's the sons and daughters who come from the working class homes. Has always been the case.